Okay, thank you very much. This afternoon, I'll be talking on leaving no one behind in education with a focus on children with disabilities. According to the World Report on Disability, an estimated 93 to 150 million children of up to age 14 live with disability. This is quite huge. And among these children, 40% of them are out of school at the primary level, while it increases to 55% of children with disabilities out of school at the secondary level. When they go to school, they are most concentrated in poorly funded segregated schools with very poor quality of education. I mean, when we compare to what is available to their peers without disabilities. And access to education is also influenced by some other social factors like gender, like displacement, language, ethnicity, and even geographical location. So, and these are factors that we need to consider when we talk about inclusive education for children with disabilities. So now I will focus on gender, and that will bring me to talk about education of girls with disabilities. You know, there's a huge disparity in the completion of primary education between males and females with disabilities. Uh, for males, 50% of them completed primary education, according to the World Report on Disability, while only 41.7% of females were able to complete primary education. Generally, among persons with disabilities, the literacy level is 3%. But this is quite lower when you consider women with disabilities, where the literacy level is just 1%. And the contributing factors to this include stigma and discrimination. To be a woman or to be a girl with disability means double discrimination, being discriminated against as a girl and also as having a disability. Also, for the fear of safety and protection, some girls with disabilities may not go to school because the parents may not be bold enough to send them to school for the fear of being bullied or for the fear of being of their rights being violated. And also, traditionally in many cultures in the developing world, uh, girls are usually given to domestic work or unpaid care. And this does not left out girls with disabilities, even though they may not send them to school because of lower value placed on girls, but they will still use them for domestic work and for unpaid care. And also some girls do not attend school due to inaccessible sanitation facilities. I remember when I worked in South Sudan, we had this girl who would not come to school at certain period of the month. Then later, after we observed this and we tried to discuss with her, we discovered that she didn't come to school on the days that she is menstruating because there were no good sanitation facilities in the school that she attended. Then, what is inclusive education? When we talk about inclusive education, we're talking about an education system that includes all learners, welcomes and supports them to learn, irrespective of their identities and abilities. It is a school where all children learn together in the same school and in the same classroom. No discrimination. Inclusive education also entails not only accessibility of the school, but participation of the learner, as well as learning to achieve his or her potentials, which then requires some provisions to be made, like teaching and curriculum must be adapted to all children. School buildings and infrastructure should be accessible. Classrooms, play areas, transport, toilets. All these factors add up to make a school to be inclusive. Then what are the benefits of inclusive education? You know, many people are skeptical about inclusive education. They believe it is not cost effective. Some parents are afraid that children with disabilities are going to slow down their own children in school. But this is not true. When children learn together, they actually learn better, because most of the strategies used in inclusive education classroom are strategies that allow all children to learn better. Also, inclusive education fosters inclusive societies. We're all part of the society that we come from, and we will always go back to our societies. And having inclusive education builds more on the foundation for inclusive societies. And of course, inclusive education is more cost effective. Cost effective more than what we have in special education, where you have to provide other facilities, the school structure and everything. But you can actually educate all children together in the same school while you provide for their support, while you support them to be able to participate and to achieve in the same school system. And of course, basic education is a constitutional right of every child. So inclusive education fosters equity. Like I mentioned, education is a human right, and children with disabilities have right to education. This right is articulated in some international frameworks, such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Right of the Child, the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action in Education, 1994, actually emphasized that children with disabilities should be accommodated in regular schools alongside their peers without disabilities. And of course, the SDG goal number 4 talks about inclusive and equitable quality education. Then what are the challenges that, the challenges to inclusive education of children with disabilities? It comes in various forms at different levels. So we will look at it from all these levels. So, and I will start from the home or the community. Disability is a stigmatizing experience. So at the home level and in the communities, stigma and discrimination based on disability, based on gender, do affect negatively inclusive education of children with disabilities. That is where you have some parents locking up their children with disabilities in the house because they don't want their neighbors to know that they even have a child with disability. Also, when there's poverty in the household, children with disabilities are more likely to be affected. And in such cases, you will find out when resources are limited, children with disabilities are not likely to be allowed to go to school. And another issue is lack of assistive devices, especially in developing countries. Assistive devices are not available, they are not affordable. Not every mother would be like my mother, who had to carry me on her back to school and back to home every day from primary education till I completed secondary education. So this is a big challenge that children with disabilities face in accessing inclusive education. Then at the school level, also, there is discrimination by teachers and by peers. And we even have teachers from regular schools who discriminate against teachers in special schools, for example. And of course, most of the learning materials are not adapted to suit children with disabilities. Most times, teachers are untrained. Teachers don't have the basics and the principles of inclusive education. And of course, the special education that many countries, many governments clamor for, we don't even have enough special education teachers. And in terms of assistive technology, this is another big area where a child with disability is likely to experience challenges in school. One, this assistive technology is not usually available in developing countries. When they are available, they are not affordable, and teachers and learners don't know how to use them. The skills to use this assistive technology is lacking in many cases. Also, the school infrastructure and communication is inaccessible. This includes toilets and even access to key areas in the school, like the libraries, the science laboratories. They are usually inaccessible to children with disabilities, as well as also communication, which is very key for children who have sensory impairments. Also, there's lack of transportation. Most of the transportation around are inaccessible, and they are not suitable for use by children with disabilities. And lastly, and the big one, is the lack of disability data. At the government level, I will start from the general education. Generally, in many low and medium income countries, there's inadequate funding of education. And this is the basis. When education generally is underfunded, then there's no foundation to build inclusive education on. Also, in most of these countries, there are no inclusive education policies, or where they exist, they are poorly implemented. There's non-allocation of budget to inclusive education, including teacher training, and of course, lack of reliable data on children with disabilities. You find out that in many countries, the education management information system does not disaggregate data by disability. So we don't even have data to plan with to be able to include children with disabilities in school. And also, there's no framework for monitoring inclusion of these children in education. And also, at the government level, there's lack of coordination between ministries. Even at times within education ministry where this resides, you find out that people are not coordinating among themselves. They only leave it to maybe special education departments, which is not supposed to be the case. And when you now talk about coordination between ministries, Ministry of Education, Social Protection, there's no coordination. They don't meet at any point. Then I'll briefly talk about inclusive education of children with disabilities in humanitarian context. Generally, education in emergency is very weak in inclusive education. And I mean, a very good example is the recent COVID pandemic, which of course took everybody by surprise, and it's revealed the systemic barriers that children with disabilities face in the education sector in emergency. We've always known that it is weak, but it became very glaring with this pandemic. For example, there's no assistive technology, the internet is usually poor, and we found out that children with disabilities were largely affected. Many of them did not have the opportunity to access remote learning like their peers without disabilities. And this is really very sad because it took them backwards. Many of them that have made progress before lost the progress that they have made during the time that movement was restricted and everybody was home. And coupling with that is the disruption in the already established networks. For example, some of these schools already have networks with rehabilitation services, with social services, but during the pandemic, these networks became disrupted and it made it worse for an average child with disability to cope under this condition. And also there's this lack of coordination between parents and teachers. And when attempt was made during the COVID-19 pandemic to now bring parents in to participate in the education of their children, it was very difficult because it wasn't the practice before the COVID pandemic. So now, how do we make it work? How do we ensure inclusive education for children with disabilities? According to the GEM report 2017-18, it says, and I quote, ensuring inclusive, equitable, and good quality education is often a collective enterprise in which all actors make a concerted effort to meet their responsibilities. And this emphasizes the need for a multi-sectoral approach to achieve inclusive education of children with disabilities. And how do we do this? First, the financing of education on the part of the government, including funding of inclusive education. Teacher training. All teachers should be trained in the basics and the principles of inclusive education so that they can all accommodate children with disabilities in their classrooms. There should be disaggregation of education and socioeconomic data by disability and gender. And governments should come up with clear strategies for implementation of inclusive education policies where they exist. And where they do not exist, there should be a development of such policies. Also, government at all levels needs to establish frameworks for monitoring inclusive education of children with disabilities. Stigma reduction strategies is a key component that everybody should concentrate on at every level, at the home, school level, community, the government. We should focus on stigma reduction strategies so that children with disabilities can be seen as not of less value than other children, and that they should be able to access education without stigma, without discrimination. Also, we need to prioritize disability inclusion within our social protection schemes, because many parents may not be able to afford the education of their children with disabilities because they are poor already, then they need social protection. So disability should be considered in social protection schemes in all countries, which is not really the case in many countries right now. Also, there should be improved access to assistive devices and assistive technology. Consideration for gender and other social factors in education planning and implementation is very, very critical. And lastly, ministries should coordinate between themselves. I was able to start schooling early enough because my pediatrician discussed with my parents. She was a medical doctor, but she collaborated with my parents to send me to school. We need more collaboration between different sectors in the government. Thank you very much.
You Actually, the first question is one that comes actually for you specifically as a person, and asks, how did you overcome your own challenges related to mobility in terms of your education and your professional development? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would say that it all started from home. Right from when I was a child, I wasn't discriminated against. You know, social development starts from home. I wasn't orientated to see that I have a disability and that it is a problem. No. Rather, my parents supported me. And that really gave me a lift, because even before I went to school, my self-esteem was already well built. So going to school, I wasn't really, I mean, I was not, I didn't look down on myself. I was ready to cope, whatever it is. Of course, there were barriers everywhere. There were barriers everywhere, but I was determined that I was going to go through it. There was no access, but with the support of my parents, some of my peers also in school assisted. And that is why, you know, it is also good to allow children with disabilities to study with their peers without disabilities. I attended regular schools because of the intervention of my pediatrician, who advised my parents to register me in a regular school, even though I was rejected initially, but later they enrolled me. And I'm sure many of my classmates, many of my schoolmates learned to know that Toyin is a child like them. So they were also ready to support me. I was a science student. My mother would take me to school on her back, drop me in school. It was difficult for me to move from my classroom to the laboratories, but my peers were doing what my mother was doing for me in school. So when we allow children with disabilities to study together with their peers without disabilities, like I mentioned in that presentation, it fosters equity, it fosters inclusion, because children, it is what you teach children that they take up. So when children know that everybody is equal, they actually go with that and they don't discriminate most times.
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, this question of discrimination came up in many questions. Let me also tell the audience, I thank you all for your questions. I'm grouping them. And a number of the questions focused on this issue. Now, your talk I found very interesting, also because I'm a political scientist, so I'm very interested in issues related to policy and programs. But there are a number of people focused on discrimination, which of course goes beyond the reach of policy in many ways, because you're talking about attitudes. So what many people are asking is what can be done to change attitudes in terms of daily behaviors and in terms of daily interactions.
Well, I think first of all, we need to raise awareness. Usually, people are afraid of what they don't understand. Many people don't understand disabilities. They don't understand impairments. They view persons with disabilities as somebody who is cursed, somebody who shouldn't be part of them, somebody who should be excluded. So at the community level, at the household level, we need to raise awareness about disability and persons with disabilities. And we need to create more opportunities for people, for society to interact with persons with disabilities. This, of course, entails many things, because many of us, in fact, all of us do face barriers to access even our communities. So that means we all need to learn to remove barriers so that persons with disabilities can also participate in society. When we participate, when everybody rubs minds, they will see that, well, it's not a big deal to live, to be a person with disability. The fact that I'm a woman with disability does not make me to be lesser in value in everything than another woman with disability. But without social interactions, this is impossible. And we can open more space for social interactions by letting people know more about disability, about impairments. I think that is where the main problem is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now there are a number of questions related to your discussion of coordination and implementation of programs in education. And there were a number of people who are asking in terms of the context, whether some people asked in terms of Africa, others in terms of development, how it is that changes, these transformative changes that you're focusing on to promote inclusiveness, can be actually implemented, not as policies in the air, but actually as programs and projects on the ground that make a difference.
Yes, as programs and projects, I think from my experience, one thing that I've learned is that most actors, most development actors will tell you that they don't know. But once you raise their awareness about disability, they are usually open to try it, to give it a try. But again, they may not have the skills. Yes, they may not have the skills, but that is not the end of it. Even if they don't have the skills, they can collaborate with organizations of persons with disabilities or with disability-focused organizations like Humanitarian and Inclusion, so that they could partner together to implement inclusive projects. And also, they can train their staff. They can raise the awareness of their staff right from the top management to the field people. They can raise awareness and train them to be able to do disability inclusive projects, because it also includes that. The project cycle, every stage of project cycle must be inclusive. There are ways to do that, and it is not difficult. It is something that they can learn easily.
Okay, thank you very much. There were a number of questions as well that came back to the question of intersectionality, and you talked about double discrimination, the question of gender, of what you called other groups, and then also people with disabilities. When we talk about this, you already mentioned this in terms of coordination. But really, I think is a broader question and a theme that's come out of the different comments that are raised in the chat is asking, how can an approach be mainstreamed for inclusiveness that does address these different sectors simultaneously, that addresses the gender perspective, disabilities, and also what you called other factors?
I think mainly it is a matter of disaggregating our data by disability, by gender, by geographical location, by displacement. If we are able to collect data that is disaggregated by these factors, then it is easier to see the vulnerabilities that come with these factors. And then it is also easier for us when we know the level of vulnerability, when we know the barriers that people face due to this, due to the interaction of these social factors, then it's easier for us to address them when we know the barriers, we know their needs, we know their priorities. But if we don't disaggregate our data by disability, gender, age, for example, it will be difficult to pick all these vulnerabilities. And then we will just be assuming that it is not there. But we would not see it unless we have the data.
This is an interesting answer because we actually have a number of questions related to different forms of disability. Specifically, we have some people who have asked about children with autism or with Down syndrome and the situation in Nigeria or in Africa, and how you would actually go about addressing these needs as well, not just physical disabilities. And I do want to mention, we have one colleague who's a social worker in the chat who asked why I use the word disability as opposed to people with special needs in terms of the way we use language to address this issue. So I want to bring that to the table as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You see, we don't use that word, special. Because when we use that word special, it connotes that the rights of persons with disabilities is something out of ordinary. There's nothing special about the rights of persons with disabilities. In fact, disability rights are human rights. By the time we begin to label it as special, it connotes that it's something we're doing, we're going an extra mile. We're going out of our comfort zone to do something, which is not true. It is a matter of right. There are different ways of achieving the same goals. So including persons with disabilities, any accommodation that you make to include persons with disabilities is just an alternative way of promoting or of protecting the rights of that individual. So there's nothing special about it. Because when we say special, people believe that, well, it's out of the ordinary. It's out of the regular. So I'm not obliged to do it. If I do it, I'm doing that person a favor, which is not the case. And that's why we don't use that word special, because there's nothing special about it. Disability rights are human rights.
Okay, thank you very much. If I can then just ask another group of questions, which are a little more in the abstract, in the sense that rather than focusing on daily interactions, they focus on the notion of inclusive or transformative development. So when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and when we talk about the Sustainable Development Agenda, 2030 Agenda, we have two questions. The first is, how can we link inclusive education to the environmental discussions that are in the agenda and in sustainability? If there's any sort of environmental aspect to inclusive education that you're aware of or that you've engaged in. And then the second one, I will admit, actually comes from me. And I mentioned that because I think it comes from some of the points that you've raised here. The SDGs mention inclusiveness in Goal 4 on education, of course, in Goal 8 on decent work, but they're not really mentioned, inclusiveness is not really mentioned in Goal 9 on infrastructure. And so I was wondering if you've been aware of this omission from the infrastructure goal, and what it is that you consider to be the separation, if you will, between inclusiveness and infrastructure, because your talk focused heavily on transportation and the needs for transportation to be more accessible. So these are the two questions. Thank you.
Yes, I'll start from the last one. Yeah, it's true that it is not all the SDG goals that emphasizes inclusion. Yes, it is not a perfect document, but it is, I would say it is an improvement from the MDGs. And a lot of advocacy went into the SDGs to get in as much of disability inclusion as we were able to get in there. So I think it's still a work in progress. By the time this 2030 comes and goes, we would have seen again what are our gains, what are the benefits of inclusion in the SDG. Then maybe it would then be another advocacy item for us to push for more. But I quite agree with you that the SDGs are not perfect in terms of inclusion, in terms of disability inclusion. I think we only have inclusion mentioned in, I think, about 4 of the goals or so.
Okay, thank you. And the environmental aspect?
And the environmental aspect, well, it depends on the way you look at it. But in the environmental aspect, the way I look at it is the removal of barriers. And when we talk about environmental barriers, for example, of course, we're talking about accessibility. And we look at accessibility holistically. And that's where we talk about comprehensive accessibility. We're not looking at only the physical environment, we're also looking at the communication, the information. that they should be accessible. And we can only achieve this by identifying what are the barriers in our environment to the inclusion of persons with disabilities. When we are able to identify those barriers, then we remove them and replace them with enablers. But of course, we have a huge problem when it comes to the environment, because the environment generally is inaccessible to an average person with disability.
Sorry, thank you very much. At this point in time, I would like to introduce our panel of experts who also would like to comment on the themes of inclusive education and inclusiveness and raise questions. And then afterward, we will ask you, Dr. Aderemi, to please come back into the conversation after the panel. And for the people who are following our discussion, I welcome you to continue sending us your questions and your comments. I am receiving them. And as we go through the panel discussion, we will have another question and answer period at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We're very honored to have Professor Catherine Leglou, who is the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs at the University of Luxembourg. As well, we have Julia McGowan, who's a global education specialist with Handicap International. And then we have Mr. Graham Lang, who's the Chief of Education at Education Cannot Wait. Now, for the panel, we have prepared 3 questions for the panelists, and we've asked them to respond to these 3 questions. So I'm going to start with Professor Leglou, and I will ask you, in what ways is the University of Luxembourg taking actions for inclusive education?
Good afternoon. I'm greatly enjoying participating in today's discussions, and I would like to thank you all for turning up as well virtually. It would have been ideal, obviously, if people had turned up in person, but I think the main point is that in our university, we support the school child as they transition into adult life, and university is a very, very important point for somebody. More and more, we're getting students who are used to having had reasonable adjustments made for their disability, whether it's visible or invisible disability, throughout their education. And so their expectation is that this will continue. Actually, in universities, in some universities, including in ours, these changes have not yet been placed securely. Our inclusion office was only created in 2018, and actually it's about changing a philosophy, an approach, to say not we try to treat our students all the same, but we try to give our students all the same opportunities, and we will find ways of adjusting what we do in order to enable every student to have the same opportunity to be able to reach the same level of achievement. That's a different approach that a university has to take. There's a second point, which is that in Luxembourg, we still have a number of contexts in which students with disabilities are actually in schools that are separate from an inclusive classroom. And so one of the objectives is actually to start training teachers into working with children with disabilities in order to create that inclusive experience, create that inclusive classroom. That requires specialist training. And for the moment, our University of Luxembourg Competence Centre is going to launch some training elements for professionals. And it's an objective for the near future that we should be able to offer this as part of the training we offer to educators in the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Leglou. I would ask Julia McGowan as well, how is your organization addressing inclusive education?
Thanks very much. Yes, we're doing a range of different approaches. And the good news, I think, for us is to say that we can do something about this. We can address this. I very much, listened to what Dr. Toyin was saying in her lecture and really identified with so much of it. Those are the challenges that we really do face in the 27 countries where we're working within HI. But however, we're trying to tackle those issues, front hand. So we work on 3 main areas of activities. And as Dr. Toyin mentioned, the first place to start is really within the home and a community level. And it's all about raising awareness, supporting parents to be aware of their children's rights to go to education, trying to deal with issues around stigma and discrimination, and just changing the overall attitudes within communities. And that's something that we try and do across the board. And we have seen results. We have seen things change. I just wanted to point out, there is some good news around this, even though despite the huge challenges that we're still facing all over the world. Secondly, I think one of the main areas is supporting service level adjustments. So we need to look outside, as Dr. Toyin was saying, we need to look outside of just the school environment. It's looking at all services that impact on education, health services, social services, in addition, of course, to the education services themselves. And really working alongside schools on things like school action plans, inclusion teams, getting people, all the different staff members within those schools on board really with inclusion. What does that mean on the ground in things like adequate support for teaching, learning and materials, as was mentioned, things like support staff to help, like classroom assistants or additional staff that maybe help children who need that little bit extra support to be able to cope in a mainstream classroom. These are kind of tangible approaches that we've seen really work well in areas where we've tried to do that. Because as has been mentioned in some of the questions I saw as well, we recognize that children are so different. We need a range of approaches to be able to include all children in mainstream education. So that's a large part of what we do. And the third main area is really at the national level, because it's all very well us trying to work in schools, in the areas where we have reach, but it's not across the board. We want to scale that up. That needs to go much further. So the way to do that is to work with ministries on their own policy development, on their action plans, looking at how they can support in terms of financing, budgeting, and also teacher training, as was mentioned. For example, the importance of pre-service teacher training for all students going through teacher training, on inclusive education, catching them all as they come through. That's really crucial. And those kinds of approaches at national level are a large part of what we do. And just a final note, if I may, as was mentioned earlier, it's actually topical because today we were launching an advocacy report on this topic, the fact that we need to do more on achieving disability inclusive education, particularly in a post-COVID world environment. And that really the key of doing this is to have multi-sectorial approaches, and that is the core approach, as was nicely highlighted by Dr. Toyin. So I just wanted to let you know that was that's being launched today, and it's really an amalgamation of many of the points that were made, but to shout that we need to do this more. We know how to do this, we have a blueprint, but we need the money, the finance and the support from all different sectors to coordinate and work together in order to do inclusive education. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Lang, how is Education Cannot Wait addressing inclusive education?
Thank you very much, Colin. And maybe just before I start to say thanks very much, Dr. Toyin, for incredibly inspiring initial remarks there in your speech. And I found myself sort of noting all the way through what I'm going to say, some of the correlations between what you said. So thank you for that. So just to start, for those of you that don't know, so Education Cannot Wait, we're the only global fund dedicated specifically to education in emergencies and protracted crises. So when we talk of reaching SDG 4 and leaving no one behind, we would argue that children and adolescents with disabilities who are affected by forced displacements through, for example, conflict and insecurity and natural disasters are very much this target group. They're the furthest left behind. And as Dr. Toyin highlighted, there are further inequalities within this already marginalized group. I mean, gender is a key factor. Data is challenging, as she said, and particularly in these crisis contexts. But we know that girls living with disabilities who are impacted by forced displacements are virtually invisible. I mean, their access to education is extremely limited. So for ECW as a global fund, what we can do is we aim to ensure that our investments prioritize these children and adolescents with a focus on girls. If we don't start with children and adolescents living with disabilities, we won't achieve SDG 4. I mean, it's as simple as that. So we've got two main funding instruments that we use. We have our first emergency response grants, which are for emergencies, and we have our multi-year resilience programs for protracted crises. And we explicitly ask for these programs to be designed to reach these most vulnerable and marginalized groups. So in the guidance that we give to our country level partners, both written and through webinars and training sessions, and in the application forms themselves, we ask for concerted efforts to address children and adolescents with disabilities, including, and there's a specific section in these applications that asks about this. And our funding in these crisis contexts is deliberately very flexible. It's needs-based, so it can cover a whole range of different aspects. It can cover, for example, improving accessibility to learning facilities. It can be used to train teachers. It can be used to purchase adaptive devices. It can be used to tackle issues such as discrimination, which was raised earlier. We haven't put a formal target on this, but our expectation is that at least 10% of the beneficiaries that are to be reached with our funds should be children and adolescents with disabilities. When we then get these applications, we then do a very rapid but comprehensive quality assurance process to check that they've responded to these directions. And we go back and we challenge partners on how are you going to reach these learners. And to be honest, the responses are mixed. It depends on the context. Our funds support some of the worst crises on the planet. It depends on the partners on the ground. It depends on lots of factors like the context, the security situation. Where we've been able to partner, and particularly with specialized organizations, because we're a global fund, we're not an implementing agency. We don't have the expertise. The expertise lies in governments, in UN agencies, international NGOs, local NGOs, civil societies. You are the organizations with the expertise. Where we're able to partner with that expertise, such as humanity and inclusion, we really see much more effective responses. And I think that's something we want to build on. And lastly, and I'll finish here, just to note, we're a very lean secretariat. We're approaching the $1 billion mark since we became operational back in 2017. We've only got 30 people on our team, so we're very small. Having said that, the extent to which we are prioritizing inclusive education, we have one post which is focusing on psychosocial support and inclusion, and we now have an additional post, separate post, looking specifically at promoting the inclusion of education of children and adolescents with disabilities in these crisis contexts. So we're very committed to this and very much glad to be part of this conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And we're going to pass now to the second question. I'm going to start this time with Ms. McGowan. When we heard Dr. Aderemi's talk, she discussed multi-sectoral challenges related to inclusive education. So what in your opinion needs to be prioritized in terms of tackling these multi-sectoral challenges?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. I think that we need to see this in the context of the SDGs. So the SDGs themselves are kind of giving us a bit of a blueprint for action, really, on the multi-sectoral. Sorry, have you got my video on? Or I just checking. Yeah, it's a blueprint really for the how to develop multi-sectoral responses and strategies. As was mentioned earlier, you have the SDGs on eliminating poverty or supporting gender issues, on health, education being one of them. So really I think we should look at the fact that we can't achieve SDGs in the next 10 years until we work and focus on a multi-sectoral approach, linking the SDGs all together. So I think that's the starting point really, because it can be challenging. I mean, Dr. Toyin mentioned so many different ways to look at how to do multi-sectoral approaches, from things like supporting prioritization in social protection schemes to making sure that WASH, so water and sanitation and hygiene, has also have a focus on inclusive education and allowing children with disabilities to be able to access those, for example. So there's just such a range of different approaches that we need to coordinate. But I think really the best way to look at it, the easiest way to look at it, is seeing the SDGs as a blueprint, seeing the fact that they come as a set of guidance to be able to allow us to have this kind of multi-sectorial response running through the whole thing. So that would be my first point, to see that as a blueprint. And the second point is looking at the child's needs at the center. If you start from the needs of the child, it's much easier then to focus on what are the multi-sectorial approaches that need to be coordinated together. Otherwise, it just feels a bit too many, like there's too many things, and maybe that's why people go into the siloed approaches, because it just seems like it might be easier. But actually, when we frame it in the way of what are the child's needs and how do we build from that, it therefore makes it's an easier way of looking at the multi-sectorial approach. So if I just take a child, then you think about what are the needs around the child: the parents, the carers, the families, the schools, the communities, and then outside of that, it could be the other civil society, NGOs, all the different sectors that need to coordinate in order to support that one child to be able to access school. And if you frame it in that way, it helps you to think about what are the ways, what are the various different agencies that need to be involved in order to allow that to happen. So I guess the tangible things to suggest would be things like developing strategies where there's a number of linked services, for example, to allow those various sectors I just mentioned to meet in a single place, or at least be signposted in a single place, so that it's easier for families and children to access those different needs. So, for example, in school, there could be a way of accessing and making it easier to have referrals to those different services. That's one example. Obviously, it's important that at a government level, as Dr. Toyin mentioned, we have coordination, as responsibilities, clearly defined roles, and that's a given. But I think we can look at ways in which our own, programs at an NGO level, at a sort of program level, are making sure that all the sectors work together, that it isn't just an education program and that there's a separate health program and there's maybe a child development program, that they all come together and work to have fully connected service delivery. So there's sort of, I think we need to see it at all different levels. So there's the multi-sectorial approaches at the national level, at coordination level, but then it goes right down to the level of service delivery. And so that's another way to frame it. There's so many things to talk about on that topic. I won't go into all of them, but I think those are the core things to hold on to when we're looking forward as to how to roll this out.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Lang, what would you prioritize for a multi-sectoral approach to inclusiveness?
Thanks very much. And I think the response is going to echo very much along the same sort of lines that Julia was saying. I mean, again, zooming into children living with disabilities in crisis-affected contexts. I mean, we firmly believe, although we are a global fund for education in emergencies, we know that education-specific interventions alone are unlikely to lead to learning and completion for education of children and young people with and without disabilities, actually. So we, in a similar sort of vein to Julia, I mean, we advocate for the delivery of holistic, multi-sectoral packages of services to teachers, to students, learning centers, communities alike, and encompassing components on issues such as psychosocial support to livelihoods, social protection, and nutrition. And I think in terms of prioritization, I think the programs that the financing instrument that I mentioned before, these multi-year resilience programs, comes back to Julia's point as well about this sort of framework that we use. And these multi-year resilience programs aim to bring both humanitarian and development actors together to plan, to respond jointly under the leadership of the government where that's possible. And in that approach, we advocate very strongly for the whole of child approach. That is, interventions that address a variety of learning, teaching, organizational, and safety needs. And conflict-affected children and youth, they often lack previous schooling experience, or that they don't have the mental or the academic readiness for learning. And so interventions on education therefore need to be complemented with the provision of health, psychosocial services, nutrition, as well as other things like cash assistance and livelihoods related schemes. And I think these multi-year programs that we're talking about provide those sorts of frameworks and try to provide that opportunity for joint planning and coordination. I think it would be remiss as a global fund if I didn't bring up the issue of financing. And I think, for us, that's the critical points. One of the key things that Education Cannot Wait is trying to do is to raise the profile of education in emergencies and protracted crises. And part of that to raise financing. I mean, the bottom line is that we need more money. We need more financing. And Dr. Toyin raised this. We're trying to galvanize donors. We're trying to particularly get the private sector partners. And I think this is an area when we're looking around disability, which is particularly interesting, to join ECW and join us in allocating more funding and more resources for education emergencies and protracted crises. Again, we are not going to reach SDG 4 if we don't prioritize education of children and youth with disabilities in these contexts. And we can't do that unless the partners on the ground that we support get the finances that they need to implement these kinds of programs to reach these learners. So I think there's a very strong piece that we need to do on this resource mobilization aspect, of which we are a critical part, in which we welcome other partners, to really position education for children and adolescents with disabilities, and to increase financing specifically for that so that they have equal access. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Leglu, what would you prioritize for a multi-sectoral approach?
I think one of the things about when we reach the higher education side is that interdisciplinarity is a great way of ensuring this multi-sectoral approach actually starts with our students, and that they get introduced to seeing things from a different set of perspectives. As Dr. Toyin pointed out, there's a great many different factors that impact on the experience of a child when they start schooling. And one of them will involve how accessible the school is, how physically accessible, for example, a laboratory is, if a child wants to do science, and so on. And then other issues such as, the interaction with school friends, the security that child has acquired at home, and so on. And therefore, if you think in terms of the links between social studies, between law, between sciences, hard applied sciences, as well as social sciences, and then obviously what that means for policymakers, I think these are all very, very important transversal conversations that students can have. I know, Harlan, that you've actually been working considerably on related issues and, for example, policy coherence for development. I don't know if you have a few words that you would like to say. Sorry to hand it over to you, but I think that this is probably an important moment for you to step in.
No, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Actually, I find this talk very interesting and this whole discussion very interesting because policy coherence for development focuses on interactions, policy interactions, and breaking silos in policy making. I think it is very important to highlight the need for policies to respond to transformative change or promote transformative change through what we're identifying as normative coherence, meaning that we find these transversal approaches that aim to promote values such as human rights. And so I think that this interdisciplinarity, this transversality that you're talking about is very important. And this actually leads into the third question that we asked our panelists. And I would like to start this time with Mr. Lang. What can be done to ensure a rights-based approach to inclusive education?
Thanks very much. Yes, I mean, I think again, as Dr. Toyin, referenced the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and within that, stating that children with disabilities have the right to receive an education in an inclusive setting. and with the necessary support to succeed. I mean, I think to make that right real, there's a number of aspects, I think, but I think for us, particularly in these emergencies and protracted crises, I mean, the aspect I want to focus on is the need to increasingly embrace and enhance accessibility, I think, as a first step. And accessibility is really, a necessary precondition for inclusive education, as it ensures that children and adolescents with disabilities can dispose, can access, can use services and products, and more generally the virtual and physical environment on an equal basis with others. And I think sort of pushing forward accessibility for enhanced learning of children and adolescents with disabilities in these crisis affected areas, for us, we see sort of twin track approach. On the one hand, humanitarian and development actors jointly with governments are going to have to retrofit, to the extent possible, existing facilities, services and approaches. And these interventions also need to be integrated with the provision of assisted devices and technologies to ensure that children and adolescents with disabilities can access and use those resources on an equal basis with others. I think very much in line with what Dr. Toyin was saying about inclusive education. On the other hand, the second track is that also new interventions are going to be necessary that include aspects of universal design, so that the environments, the services and the approaches don't place children and adolescents with disabilities differentially at risk of being left behind. I mean, importantly, I think the progressive uptake of universal design is going to reduce future costs that would be incurred to enhance access and use among specific groups, such as children and adolescents with disabilities. And I think, coming back to this big issue around coordination, and I do think, it is this issue around coordinating with national, international actors remains fundamental, I think, for the sort of the implementation of what we describe here as this twin track approach. I mean, standards, codes, policies need to be developed to enhance this accessibility in these emergency contexts and these protracted crisis contexts. And I think, I think it's really important that accessibility becomes a building block of the programming that we support, and the implementation supports that. So I think that's how we would ensure that rights-based approach transfers into concrete reality on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Leglu, if you could give us your thoughts, please, on a rights-based approach to inclusive education.
I think that one of the most important aspects of this is simply designing policies around the concept of inclusion that actually involve actions. And so on the one hand, we have accessibility, but also we have a commitment to actually make it happen. Because somebody can come up with a policy, but actually making it happen involves training, it involves training people, it involves also actually looking at curriculum and saying, well, is our curriculum actually the sort of subject that a student with a disability would want to feel involved in, would actually feel that it's a curriculum that speaks to them. So it's about thinking about things in a very holistic way about how it influences the student. There's one example I'm going to give actually about something that we haven't talked about, because I think it's a little bit of a Luxembourg specific issue, but it's a very interesting one. Yesterday, there was an FNR prize was awarded to Claudine Kirsch and Simone Martini on their project, which is creating videos that support early years and nursery trainers in language. And this is a very specific issue in a multilingual environment, that there are other forms of exclusion as well, such as linguistic exclusion, that can really strongly affect students and strongly affect very young children. Now, if you add a disability into that linguistic inclusion issue, then we really have to look at, in a very particular context, which is Luxembourg, what actually can be done. It's quite normal for students, for children in this country, to grow up speaking up to 4 or 5 languages, but there may be 2 languages at home, and then there's 3 languages in the classroom starting from daycare. So actually thinking about that, and thinking about the fact that for children to feel comfortable speaking a number of languages, and in some cases if a child has a disability, being allowed to express themselves in a number of different, for example, types of sign language, it's also extremely important. And that's about training the trainers. It is also about changing policies within schools so that the child is not punished, and is not made to feel bad because they lack a particular linguistic form of expression. It's about creating an environment where trainers are confident with a multilingual child and also can help and support a child who also has a disability within that context.
Thank you very much. And Ms. McGowan, how would you address the issue of rights-based inclusive education?
Yeah, I would first of all like to say I absolutely agree with everything that Graham and Catherine said, to the extent where I might slightly change what I was going to say, but I think those points are very crucial. And I wanted to build actually on something that Graham said around, you know, the twin track approach and the different approaches needed to actually implement inclusive education. You know, building on this idea of needing to focus on accessibility, that is absolutely a crucial area, but there are other areas. And I think one of the things we haven't talked much about today is the reasonable accommodation, this concept of reasonable accommodation, which is outlined in the UNCRPD, the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And also to follow up on that, there's also the general comment, which is very crucial, that came out in 2016, which is a kind of, again, using the word blueprint again, but more of a kind of guidelines really on how to implement the convention when it comes to inclusive education, because I think a lot of states were struggling to actually put it into the reality. And that is all about those tangible actions that Catherine was saying. You know, we have the conventions, those rights are there, they are spelt out in all of the various rights, be it the right to the child, also, you know, the Salamanca Statement. We've got all those conventions, and indeed nations that have ratified them are bound by international law to enact those rights. However, how do they do that? And sometimes before, what was happening is that this idea of reasonable accommodation was kind of then put as an excuse that some countries, well, it wasn't reasonable for them to do various accommodations because it's too expensive, it wasn't possible in a context, and therefore, you know, it was okay for them to not include certain children because it wasn't possible to do so. So I think what we have now is the general comment from 2016 and subsequent various useful guidelines that have come out to try and help practitioners and states to know how to do those things, how to make inclusive education that's written in the convention to become a reality. So it's about accessibility. It's also about things like supports for teachers. Not every child learns the same way. Some children might need additional support from people, from materials, from the style of teaching. They might not always need to be in the mainstream classroom. They might need some time you know, with a smaller group, for example. You know, there's different approaches that might be needed, and there's sort of the supports required on that is something also that comes under reasonable accommodation. You know, what are those measures? So I think that's, to me, if those things are realized, that's the way to ensure a rights-based approach, and to just understand that, you know, we are all entitled to our human rights. This isn't something that Dr. Toyin said. Children with disabilities are part of that. It shouldn't be something special. However, not all children are the same. So those approaches might be different, but it shouldn't be special. It's just part of human rights. So yeah, that's what all I want to say on that.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have another set of questions that have been sent in to me, but before we get to them, I would like to invite Dr. Aderemi to integrate into the panel discussion. Is there anything you would like to react to?
Okay, thank you very much. It's been very interesting. But I just want to comment on the issue of financing of education again, because I know that this is a very big problem in many countries. And I see the role of the donors or the development partners in this as well. Because most of these governments would not allocate adequate funding to education. And they will not even think about inclusive education, even when they have the policies. But I think that donors can influence them. Donors can influence them to pay more attention to inclusive education and also to raise their financing of education in general. Because in many of our developing countries, many sectors of the economy are currently being driven by donors, by the development partners. And that's the truth. But I think they should channel these aids in such a way that the government takes more responsibility as well, because we all know that the development partners cannot be there all the time to take up the responsibilities of the government. Otherwise, all that we're talking about will not be sustainable. Because when the donors are not there again, then the government will not do anything. So I think the donors could influence the government to be more responsive in terms of education, inclusive education for children with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, your comments were apropos because they relate to the last group of questions that I had from people. And I would like to say that we have people writing in from all over the world. We have one comment specifically coming from Mexico, and someone who mentioned that many of the different issues that you're discussing are also present in Mexico. And the question related to that was, how can policies be made more responsive to people with disabilities? And other questions related to that were focusing specifically on budgets. And I want to bring that up because you just mentioned donors, for example. I know that earlier this year, ECOWAS tasked its member states to specifically budget measures in education for people with disabilities. One of our colleagues who's written in discussed the World Bank and the World Bank's mandate for people to budget programs in inclusive education. Do you see budgets actually facilitating change? I mean, rather than reflecting change, do you see budgetary measures as a way to promote inclusive education?
Yes, I would say to a good extent, it's an important factor to promote inclusive education, because also from my experience, many times when you approach them, what they tell you is that they don't have funds. They'll tell you there's no funds for it. Even when they are willing, they will tell you, well, no budget allocation, so there's nothing they can do. But of course, budget alone is not enough. It is key, it is important, but it is not enough. We still need a lot of change of mindset, because I see that also as a very big problem. Because many of these people in government who are in charge of education do not even have the rights-based approach to inclusive education. They don't prioritize the education of children with disabilities. They still hold their beliefs, their wrong beliefs, their negative attitudes from the society that they come from, that children with disabilities should not be educated. They don't really see the value to invest in inclusive education. And that is why we need to also address stigma reduction at all levels. I've seen it play out several times in my country, where even the government people will tell you, we're still dealing with the normal people. That's the word they use. We're still dealing with the normal people. So invariably, inclusive education of children with disabilities is not a priority, because they believe that they're still dealing with the normal people, in quotes. So the mindset is really, really bad, and it has to be changed for any investment in inclusive education to be more effective. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you. And I want to also invite our panelists to respond. So I would like to ask Ms. McGowan if you would like to address this issue.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's really crucial, actually. And I think a way that we can equally influence donors, and donors influence ministries, is by coming together with large-scale commitments. And I wanted to raise I don't know who were there, but at the Global Disability Summit a couple of years ago, the first one in London, and there's been subsequent ones, really tried to do that. They brought countries together with donors to come up with sets of commitments that they you know, stuck to, that hopefully they will stick to and be accountable to when it comes to disability, and education was part of that. So there are a whole number of inclusive education commitments, and it was as a result of that, as was mentioned, I think earlier, the World Bank, for example, have their, you know, disability inclusive education criteria. By 2025, all of their programs, education programs, will, you know, be focused on, well, have a criteria around disability inclusion, meaning that all of their mainstream education programs will have to take into consideration disability inclusion. And for me, I think that's the way of, you know, trying to influence these large-scale donors who are, as you said, Dr. Toyin, you know, the ones who do have influence. We need to make sure that they are, you know, accountable, and also things like results-based financing can also influence what the countries themselves are delivering in terms of disability inclusion, by putting some sort of accountability into what programs are out there, you know, what education programs are running, so that children with disabilities aren't left behind and they're actually part of, you know, the funding that they get, really. And I think without those kinds of measures like indicators and commitments and results-based financing, you're going to keep having, you know, words are lovely, you know, people talk and say, absolutely, we really believe in this, and they go away and nothing changes. So we need these kinds of commitments and indicators that actually guide, are backed up by money and finance, as you mentioned. That's all I wanted to mention on that.
No, thank you very much. Mr. Leng, you also in your comments mentioned the power of funding and the need to utilize funding to promote change. Would you like to add any comments?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, you know, ECW, we were designed for crises, you know, for crises, emergencies and protracted crises. And I think we come at it from a perspective, as I mentioned, of trying to raise additional financing, primarily from in-country partners. So that includes the state, but it also includes development partners, it includes humanitarian donors, it includes the private sector. So really trying to see how we can advocate and lobby and provide the frameworks, and it comes back to this whole idea of joint planning and coordination, how we can work with partners to set these frameworks up, to provide this coordination, so that we can then align financing behind these multi-year, particularly these multi-year frameworks, and ensure that there's financing available. And I think, you know, one of the questions I saw in the chat was, education often gets cut at times of crisis. You know, one of the first things that gets cut, and I think COVID has really sort of amplified, you know, that impact. And what we've done is we've really stepped up to the plate and tried to ensure, in fact, that the opposite, that we're increasing more. And we, you know, as part of our COVID response, we gave grants of over $45 million to 33 different country contexts to try and, you know, and again, really much focused on the emergencies and these protracted crisis affected zones. That's our niche. That's where that's what we were developed for. And that's where we want to ensure that there is sufficient financing coming in to support those activities, and sufficient, and I want to emphasize this, flexible financing. The whole point of getting this financing is that it's not earmarked, that we can allow our partners with the expertise on the ground to be able to design and implement the programs that they know best. We're not the experts, but what we can do, and I know, as everybody said, it's not just financing that fixes it, but financing goes a long way to helping, you know, these organizations on the ground to actually deliver. So I think, you know, we are, despite what's happened as a result of COVID, we're still fighting very strongly at the global level, but also at country level, to try and make sure that those cuts don't happen, and that for those real marginalized children, those displaced children, those host communities, that they're not impacted any further by this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Leglu, what are your thoughts on the issue of finance and inclusiveness?
I think it's been very interesting with the pandemic to actually see how enormously energetic and generous some private funders were actually. And we had a number of groups that are some charitable, some a little bit more sort of institution-based, who really stepped in very, very fast and offered to help students and said, how can we help students? And I think that very similar things have happened across the country. There's been a real sense of a solidarity there that I hope will actually stay there for the long term, because people became aware of, for example, not having adequate internet connection, and the fact that students have got very cut off, that whole families have got very cut off. And in a way that was a surprise, that there just wasn't that assumption that these forms of inequality could actually happen. And of course they do. From the point of view of our involvement with ministries, actually, here, of course, the distance between us and our ministries is actually quite small across Luxembourg. But we do have, for example, a number of ministries and a number of other private groups and funders who help out with some students who are refugee students. So students who have experiences of displacement and also experiences of extremely fragmented education as a result of that. And again, what you can see is actually that perhaps in Luxembourg, it's easy to coordinate in a way that it isn't in some other contexts. But you can see the energy and the commitment that comes through there, with the fact that if people say, okay, as long as we know how we can help, we will actually coordinate and we will help. And I think those things are enormously positive and also enormously important. It's about educating the possible funders in how they can help, not just saying, well, we'd like to give money, but we don't know how. And I think that's important.
Okay, thank you very much. I would have loved to have given this last question to all of the panelists, but I'm afraid that we're really getting close to the end of time. So I'm only going to have the opportunity to ask Dr. Aderemi, but I would welcome all the panelists to continue the exchange afterward. And that is related to the question of partnerships, because a lot of this discussion focuses on the relationships between international donors, civil society, national governments, but also communities. Dr. Aderemi, what are the characteristics, or what are you looking for when we talk about an effective partnership for inclusive development? And this, of course, is related to SDG 17, related to effective development partnerships.
Okay, thank you very much. When I look at effective partnership, I look at each partner coming up strongly in its own area of expertise and getting committed into that, so that we can have like a pool of talents on inclusive education, coming together, collaborating together, doing what they know to do best to achieve inclusion. That's the way I would look at it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Aderemi. I would like to thank you for your talk. I would like to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. I would also like to thank the organizing committee for this event. There were a number of people who made this possible. So if everyone will bear with me, I would like to thank from Handicap International, Valentina Pomato and Hélène Lopresti, and from the University of Luxembourg, my colleague, Professor Conchita D'Ambrosio, who are all involved in the establishment of this interesting exchange. And with that, I would like to thank also everybody who joined us for this event. I would like to thank the European Commission, of course, and the United Nations Development Program. So thank you, and stay connected to the Kapuscinski Development Lecture series. I think this is a wonderful initiative that allows us to really exchange on very important issues. Thank you very much.